Hello, Chris from Mammoth Interactive here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make a quick and easy button in HTML and CSS, and you'll be able to hover over it and see some simple transitions. So to get started here, as you can see, I just have a blank HTML file, and what I'm going to do right now is, so in the body of the HTML, which is where you always want to put your code here that you want the people on your website to see, I'm just going to define a button here. So we can actually do that using the button identifier here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a class. Now a class is something you give to an HTML element that you know you're going to want to style or do something with later. So in this case, I'm just going to label it button, and I'm going to call it I am a button. Okay, and I'm going to make sure to close that off. So now if I were to show you what this looks like, if I go to the output here, you can see that, okay, so it made a simple button. This is built-in styling, comes out of the box with HTML here. If you define a button, this is what you get. As you can see, I can click on it, but it doesn't really do anything at the moment. No styling changes or anything like that. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to jump over to our CSS file. So in our CSS file, I'm going to open that up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that button that we just defined. And I can do that by calling the class name that I gave it. So I gave it the name button. And to call classes in CSS, you just put a dot in front of it. So if I had named this something else, for example, hello, then I would just have to say dot hello over here. But you know what? It's always a good idea to kind of make your classes descriptive as to what they are. So I'm going to rename this to button again. In our CSS, I'm going to go button. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a couple things that will change the styling of the button. The first thing I'm going to show you guys how to do is how to make rounded edges. So in CSS, to make rounded edges around something, you do something called border radius. So border would be, say, for example, the entire outline of the element. So border radius, for example, you can put in all kinds of different info. You can put in a percentage, you could put in a pixel, and that's going to be how rounded the corners will be. So for example, if I put in 50% border radius, what's that going to look like? Well, as you can see over here, whoops, let me just redo that here. Okay, as you can see here, it makes the entire thing rounded. So not exactly what I'm looking for. I can also put in, say, a pixel amount. That'll be a little bit more specific here. So if I were to put in, for example, 4 pixels, okay, that's what that looks like. Let's just see what happens here if I were to try 100 pixels. Okay, that's quite a bit more rounded. And you can kind of play with this and see, you know, what you prefer, what you like. There's all kinds of different options out there. But for our example here, I'm just going to go again with 4 pixels. Kind of nice to read. And as you can see, it's kind of a modern looking button now. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do, as you can see, there's kind of a border around this. And you know what? I don't really like that. So what I can do is I can actually get rid of that. And the way we get rid of things like that in CSS is we just say none. So if I say border, none, you can see that it got rid of that shadow that was there before, just to show you again. Okay, here's the border, border, none. All right, so you can still click on it. It's still actually a button. It just still doesn't do anything. All right, next thing, we can always change the font size in CSS. And to do that, as you might imagine, you just say font-size. And here you can resize it however you like. Let's say I wanted, say, a huge button and I wanted to make it 100 pixels. Okay, you can see that the button expands to fit the font. The font is now huge, 100 pixels. Not exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm going to make a bit of a smaller change here. 20 pixels. Hey, that looks pretty good now. Right, so it's a nice, big, legible button. You can see it's got some nice rounded edges still. All right, and next thing I'm going to show you guys is how to add padding. So what is padding? Well, it's easier just to show you. So padding, if I add, say, 100 pixels of padding, what is that going to look like? Okay, so you can see that it kind of adds spaces on the inside of the button. So between the text and the outside, there's all this space here, and that's padding. So obviously 100 pixels is probably way too much, more than we would want for this specific button. So if I kind of take off 0, hey, that looks pretty good. Some nice padding there. Let's see what, oh, I don't know, 20 pixels looks like. Okay, a little bit different. I kind of like the look there of the 10 pixel padding there. So here we can see nice spacing there between the letters and the outside of the button. All right. Next thing we can do is we can kind of play with the width of the button. We could also adjust the height if we wanted to. So for example, if I wanted to make it a taller button, I don't know, let's go with 1000 pixels. You can see that it's kind of looks a little bit crazy. So probably not going to adjust the height, but what I can do is adjust the width. Right, so width, let's try this again here. So 500 pixels, let's just see what that looks like. And you know, it's always a good idea to kind of just play with your CSS here and refresh your page there and see how it's affecting your text. So 500 pixels looks a little bit too wide for us here. Let's say we go with 200 pixels. And what's that going to look like? All right, so that looks all right. It's a nice big button. Looks like the font is a good size. The width is looking pretty good here. So as you can see, when I hover, it still doesn't do anything though. Nothing happening. And I actually want to put in some kind of change, something that happens when I hover over it. So we can use what's called a pseudo selector for that. And pseudo selectors are things that happen, let's say when you click on something or you hover over something. So the way you call a pseudo selector, so I'm going to call my dot button again here. So again, this is selecting the class that I put onto the button from earlier. And all I need to do is say, okay, so when I hover, you can see I put a colon and then hover. And now I just put in something that's going to happen when I hover over it. So just to make this stand out, let's, I'm going to change the background color. Let's see, background color. And you know what, let's make it bright yellow and see what that looks like. So now I have my hover here. Ooh boy, that's pretty bright. But you can see it's working. So when I hover my mouse over, it highlights. When I take my mouse off, it takes off the highlight. Pretty cool, right? Let's make this so it's not as jarring. You could put in any color you like in here. I'm just going to put in light blue. It's going to be a little bit more pleasing on the eyes here. Ah, there we go. Hey, that looks pretty good. There's all kinds of cool effects you can do when you hover. I'm going to show you guys how to change the size. So this, you can do something called a transform in CSS. And there's all kinds of attributes you can call. I'm going to show you how to scale it. So scale will change the size based on the number you input. So let's say I wanted to make it smaller. You can just put in a numerical value here. So let's say I wanted to make it 0.5. That would be 50% of the original size. So let's see what happens when I hover over it. Wow, you can see that it immediately jumped to being quite a bit smaller here. Let me just highlight that for you. So you can see it's quite a bit smaller. It's a little bit too small. I don't really want my button to shrink that much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it, say, 80%. 80% is usually pretty good to go to. Hey, that looks all right. It's kind of nice for emphasis. It makes your website look pretty modern if you can do this with some of your text or your buttons. But you know what I don't like is that it just immediately jumps to being smaller. And fortunately for us, there is a way to smooth that out a bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a transition. And when we add a transition along with the time, that will slow the movement so that it matches whatever time you put in. So I'm going to add that up here in my button, like my initial class here. So button, and what I'm going to say is, okay, whenever there's a transition, so whether it's into or out of, hover, whatever it may be. So for all transitions, let's see what happens if we put in, I don't know, 1 second. What is that going to look like? Well, let's take a look here. You can see it's quite a bit smoother now. Looks a lot more modern. Just to show you one more time. Hey, that looks pretty good. this you can also play with the time. So if you want it to not transition so quickly, you can put in whatever you like. So let's say 5 seconds. What does that look like? It's going to transition very slowly because it takes 5 seconds from start to finish. And you can, of course, also make it a lot faster. So if you say 0.1 second, it's going to transition pretty quick there, as you can see. So pretty good to make a responsive website if you want your users to highlight stuff. This will be a good tool for you to use. Pretty good standard to go with, in my opinion, is 0.5 seconds. As you can see, it's pretty smooth. It's kind of a nice in between the two. And then if I show you again here, highlighted, so that looks pretty good. So give it a try. You can play with this however you like. If you wanted to make the padding bigger or smaller, change the font size. You can make a tiny little font. Whatever you like. You could even do something like change the font size on hover. So for example, let's say we wanted to make the font size bigger when we hover it. We can definitely do that. That looks pretty cool. And that's going to do it for this tutorial. For more, please visit mammothinteractive.com. Thanks, and see you next time.